Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Good Dram Show with me, Chris Goodrum. Okay, so this afternoon we're finished with Scandinavia for a short while, and as you can obviously see from the title page, we're looking at the Series 3 releases from North Star. Now, generally speaking, you know, I like to do half dozen. I think that's probably about the right amount. And whenever there's a series of new releases from an independent or a distillery or something like that, there's always one or two that, you know, for one reason or another I decide, you know, to drop out and just, you know, pick the six. But unfortunately today I just couldn't do it. All 7 of them were absolutely fantastic. So in order to make sure this episode of the show doesn't become something of a Gone with the Wind style epic, shall we say, I'm going to just crack on and introduce what we're going to be tasting this afternoon. So we're going to kick off with a Glen Moray, a 9-year-old Glen Moray, distilled in November of 2007, bottled as all of these are or were, shall we say, in September of 2017, bottled at 57.7 and aged in a bourbon hogshead. Second bottling we're going to be looking at is Benrinnes. This is a 10-year-old Benrinnes distilled in November of 2006. It spent 9 years in an ex-bourbon hoggy and 1 year finishing in ex-Pedro Ximenez sherry. So could be interesting. Benrinnes can be a bit hit and miss at times, it has to be said. I've tasted some really good ones and some not so good ones, it has to be said. Then we're going to be looking at the oldest release in Series 3. This is a 24-year-old Cambus. This has been aged in refill PX sherry. I think you're going to see a bit of a theme developing here. It was distilled in May of 1993 and bottled at 52.7%. Next bottling we'll be looking at is a Bruichladdich. Now this is 15-year-old Bruichladdich, distilled in July of 2002, bottled at 57.1 and was aged in an ex-Radu French oak wine cask, which I think Ian basically said he thinks is ex-Bordeaux, but you know, we shall see what it's like when we get to it. Could be interesting. And then we're going to move on to well, an undisclosed distillery. Now, when I originally got sent the sample, it was just called Island, so that kind of meant could have been from several different islands. And initially my first thoughts when on tasting was it possibly could have been Jura, but it isn't, because in actual fact now it's been bottled, it's been labelled as an Orkney, and it's not from Scapa. So, you know, I think you probably figure out which distillery it does come from. So this is 17 years old. It was distilled in September of 2000. Again, 16 years in ex-bourbon hoggy and 1 year in sherry. Funnily enough, PX sherry. See what I mean? And it's only because because as you know, North Star or Ian bottled a PX. An actual PX, you know, you may well remember from the last tasting that had been aged or finished in ex-Islay casks, and so he's got all these casks of PX sherry knocking about, or empty casks. So what do you do with them? Well, there you go. Anyway, the next or the penultimate bottling we'll be looking at is peated Glenturret. This was distilled in March of 2009. Aged in a refill bourbon hoggy and bottled at 57.1. Now, interesting enough, peated Glenturret is called Rudamore, I believe that's the correct pronunciation, and it was going to be called that, but apparently on the paperwork they spelt it wrong, so it had to be bottled as what it was saying on the paperwork, which was obviously wrong, so Ian's just decided to drop the that particular epithet, shall we say. So peated Glenturret, I've tasted peated Glenturret before from the distillery and I can't say I was overly impressed, but you know, we shall see what that one's like. Well, it's obviously going to be good because it's in the tasting, isn't it? Well, it might not be, I might be criticising it, you never know. And the final bottling we'll be looking at is again from an undisclosed Islay distillery. It was distilled in September of 2004. Making it 12 years old, aged in a bourbon hoggy and bottled at 52.3. from a distillery on the south of the island, apparently. I don't know whether I'm allowed to say where they come from, because I know, but I won't. But I've just given you the clue of where it's come from anyway, so so there you go. Anyway, that's this afternoon's little lineup, and like I said, without wanting to turn this into a Hollywood epic, I'm going to kick off with the Glen Moray. Right, okay, so let's see what the Glen Moray gives us then, shall we? That is a lovely nose, kind of classic Glen Moray, lightly honeyed, white fruit, plenty of barley, apricot, little bit of minerality, citrus. That is really beautiful. It's a lovely nose, it has to be said. Yeah, pretty much you can guarantee, Glen Moray is going to be pretty damn good quality, it has to be said, wherever it tends to come from. I mean, yeah, there's been the odd one or two bottlings, like every distillery has, but this is absolutely gorgeous. The barley's got a very aromatic character. It's very youthful, but not too youthful. It's got some freshness. That is absolutely gorgeous. This is the sort of whiskey that really ticks my boxes, shall we say. There's an almost kind of substrata of almost tropical fruit. It's just so juicy and gorgeous. It's just absolutely fantastic. A little bit of spice coming through now as well. Now that's good whiskey. Let's see what the palate's like then, shall we? A little bit more oak on the palate, some tannins, a little bit of coffee, less exuberantly fruity, more kind of dusty-ish kind of barley, but it's got a lovely sweet barley note as well. Bit drying, but it's got a counterbalancing, honeyed note. So you've got the honeyed sweetness, you've got a little bit of bitterness, coffee from the oak. I think that's just an all-round really lovely whiskey. I don't really have enough to sort of bother putting any water with it, but from memory, when I did taste it with a little drop of water, it really just opened it up quite pleasantly. You get some more of the natural oils, a little bit more forward oak, but that is just a fantastic whiskey, and not particularly expensive as well, which is always nice. Right, moving on to the Benrinnes. This is the first of the Pedro Ximénez finished releases in this series, so let's see what the nose gives. Quite dense, chunky, barleyed. The PX sherry is kind of just nicely sat in the background, adding a little bit of treacle, a little bit of dried grape, some wood spice. But the quality and the character of the barley is really sort of shining through. And like I said, I mean, Benrinnes can be a bit hit and miss, it has to be said. But this is certainly one of the hits. There's a little bit of toffee coming out now. Touch of grass. And again, not particularly expensive. Lovely, aromatic, balanced. Plenty going on, good spirit character, oak character from the two casks. This is, what more can you ask for? This is just, again, a lovely whiskey. Let's see what the palate gives us. Soft, unctuous, a little bit more PX on the palate, so you get a bit of treacle and dried grape up first, and then it moves into the American oak, so you get a little bit of vanilla, a little bit of toffee, some lovely mouth-watering citrus, barley, I mean, it really is mouth-watering. I was sort of having to wipe my lips. It's absolutely fantastic. A lovely whiskey, again, really balanced, lovely progression, which is what I often tend to bang on about. And the sort of the PX is kind of coming back a little bit right on the aftertaste, a little bit of nuttiness, again a little bit of the dried grape and treacle kind of coming back. So it kind of does a sort of like a full circle, if you like, and that is an absolutely lovely whiskey. Okay, so let's move on to the Cambus. So this is 24 years in an ex-refill PX cask, although I don't think this one was one of Ian's doings. I imagine he bought this as was. So let's see what the nose gives us. Well, for that length of time in an ex-PX cask, I imagine it was quite refilled, shall we say. It's very, very subtle on the sherry notes. There's a little bit of smoky oak possibly, but it's really all about that sort of kind of slightly taut dried fruits, sort of more in the kind of sultanery, lighter sort of dried apricot kind of end of the spectrum. A little bit of a fern, there's a sort of a kind of a brackeny, ferny kind of note kind of coming through, which again is probably the herbalness from the PX cask. And that's obviously the herbalness has probably just kind of stayed a little bit longer than the sort of the wininess. I think getting quite smoky now. You're getting a little bit of treacle kind of coming through, but that is again a delightful nose. And as you know, I do love my old grain whiskies, and it's got that lovely kind of fresher edge to it. I mean, it's, you know, middle-aged-ish, I guess, as far as grains kind of go. So it's just starting to develop that sort of, you know, slightly oxidised kind of character, but still retaining that sort of fresh, crisp column still character as well. So another lovely nose. Let's see what the palate's like. Quite toffeed, dried fruits, drying spice, a little bit of bitter chocolate, a little bit of PX grapey kind of wininess right on the finish. Lovely smokiness, a real buttery kind of French oaky kind of character right on the finish in actual fact, which is, I mean, it could be ex-French oak, it could be an ex-French oak Pedro Ximenez cask. I mean, you know, it's just a refill PX cask. It could kind of come from anywhere, but it certainly seems to me it's got that kind of toasty kind of, not American oak toast, but it certainly kind of feels like French oak toast and butter. But even so, I mean, that is absolutely gorgeous. Again, you know, really nicely balanced, not too heavy on the wininess, really sort of good complexity. I like that. Right, okay, so let's move on to the 15-year-old Bruichladdich. Let's see what the nose gives us on this. Quite malty, chunky, dark, a little bit of peat, a little bit of salt. It's certainly not kind of the sort of Bruichladdich as I would remember the old 15, for example, from the distillery. But then, of course, that was all American oak, and this isn't. This is, you know, an ex-wine cask. It's got a little bit of wininess, there's a little bit of red fruit, but it seems to be more about the chunky maltiness of the spirit. I mean, it's not a bad nose at all. It's just sort of it's quite interesting. The wininess, like I said, is quite subtle. Touch of wood spice. The only quibble I have is with the price. I mean, I know Bruichladdich casks cost you an arm and an absolute leg, but this was going to, or have to retail for I think about £125, and I'm not kind of convinced that it's really worth that. If you were to say sort of 90 quid, yeah, I think I would sort of say, yep, that's fair dues. It's a 15-year-old Bruichladdich, bottled at cask strength, but 125, yeah, I think that's just pushing it a smidge, shall we say. But like I said, yeah, it's a kind of chunky, not exactly sort of floral and delicate kind of Bruichladdich. It's a earthy, chunky, slightly winey, a little bit of tar coming out now. I mean, it's got some lovely complexity. It's a good cask, absolutely nothing wrong with it at all. So let's see what the power gives. Dark, malty, treacly, touch of dark red fruits, plenty of spice, a lot of drying tannin, little bit of almost kind of oxidised fruit kind of coming through as well, touch of bitter chocolate. It's a big chunky Bruichladdich. It's not sort of light and elegant and delicate. It's a chunky one. Nice salty aftertaste. Yeah, like I said, I think it's a lovely cask. It's a lovely whiskey. No off notes, nothing wrong with it whatsoever. It's got depth, it's got complexity. It's just too expensive in my opinion, but that's me. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Orkney then from anyway, let's see what this gives us. Now, the reason I kind of said Dura, it is quite heavy, it's quite malty, it's dark, there's a lot of PX character, and there's not a huge amount of distillery character. There's a little edginess right in the background, and I suppose, knowing where it comes from now, it's not, shall we say, a major surprise. It has to be said. I find, whiskey from that particular distillery, as you well know, not quite as good as it used to be, shall we say. There's far too many slightly sort of ropey bottlings. But anyway, kind of coming back to this, it's pretty much all about the PX. It's winey, it's big, it's chewy. Well, I'm assuming it's chewy. It certainly smells chewy. There's a little floral note kind of coming out, a little floral barley, some violet possibly. Fragrant, quite fragrant PX, in that sort of heathery kind of fragrance. Again, there's a little bit of toasted oak underneath, and there's a slight roughness, shall we say, which, within the context I have no issue with. I don't mind it being a little bit rough and ready. It's when that is kind of all you can taste or smell, that's when I have an issue. As long as there's other stuff happening, you can forgive it a bit of roughness, shall we say. And I mean, although this is not my favourite style of whiskey by a long shot, it's still, a pretty good whiskey in its own right, and there are a lot of people that will really enjoy this. Certainly, you of the dirty sherry brigade are probably going to enjoy it, although it's probably not dirty enough for you. But anyway, you'll still probably enjoy it. Let's see what the palate gives us then, shall we? Big, treacly, burnt treacle, a bit of burnt sugar as well, a little bit of a rougher edge as well, loads of heather, a bit of honey, barley, well, yeah, a smidgen of barley. It's just sort of like an intimation of barley, really. This is all about the sherry cask. It's big, it's winey, it's quite salty on the finish in actual fact, really quite drying, and again, like I said, there is that sort of slight roughness, but the kind of winey, treacly kind of PX kind of just sort of veneers over that sort of slightly rougher element. And you know, it has this, you know, attraction. You know, there's nothing like a bit of rough every now and again, as they say. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Glenturret. Now I tasted, like I said, the distillery bottling, peated Glenturret, about a year, maybe so, 2 years ago possibly, when they dropped the 10 and out came these no age statement bottlings. You know, there was a peated, there was a sherry cask or whatever, and they were nowhere near as good as the old 10-year-old. I mean, I was never a huge fan of the 10-year-old anyway. It was pleasant enough, I suppose, and very popular. But anyway, let's see what the nose gives us on this then, shall we? Hard barley, a little bit industrial, but there's a lot of peat, a lot of almost medicinally kind of peat, which to a certain extent distracts from that slightly industrial character. There's a smidgen of vanilla. It's brash. There's no kind of sweetness that you would normally associate with the distillery. There's an almost fishiness to it as well, which is really quite surprising. I wouldn't have expected that. I would have, like I said, expected more kind of a mainland drier kind of peat character, but this has certainly got a pseudo Islay kind of character, or almost kind of, I suppose, Campbelltowny really. You know, that sort of fishy kind of brininess. Again, a bit of barley. It's pretty simple stuff, but you know what, I actually quite like that. You know, it's you know, you want something a bit different. You know, you want a peated malt, but you don't want an Islay. Then and this is going to sort of fit the bill. Yeah, let's see what the palate gives us. That's a nice palate. Kind of opens up with a little bit of honey, a little bit of sweet barley, which is what you would expect from Glenturret, and then in comes the sort of like the earthy peat. It really builds nicely on the palate, and I'm getting pepper and burnt wood notes and a little bit of fish. Maybe not quite so much of the medicinal, but maybe more kind of camphory kind of possible, maybe the mentholy sort of notes. Quite dry, quite intense. I mean, it is bottled at 57%, so you would expect the alcohol to kind of just chop the finish off a little bit. And I think from looking at my notes, I think a little bit of water does kind of just adds to the sweetness, certainly on the palate. But you know what, I really like that. I think that's really very, very good. I think the palate is possibly a little bit more interesting than the nose. The nose is fundamentally sort of not one-dimensional, but straightforward. But the palate is really nice, and it kind of lingers once you kind of like get over the alcohol on the finish. It's a little bit drying. It's in the cheeks, but it's entertaining, and it's a little bit different. And you know, balanced against the distillery bottling, that's a damn sight better. Right, and finally, let's move on to the 12-year-old undisclosed Islay. Let's see what the nose gives us on this. Quite dense, oily, some pleasant barley. I mean, when I first tasted this, it kind of put me in mind of Coal Ila, a sort of the more modern style of Coal Ila, the slightly more oilier, heavier style of spirit that they seem to be releasing these days. There's a little bit of medicinal notes. I mean, it's not Coal Ila, by the way, because obviously Coal Ila isn't Scythe, but yeah, it's not particularly sweet, but it's got some nice barley, some oak, some peat. yeah, it's pleasantly fresh. It's got yes, it's an attractive nose at the end of the day, and it is very, very Islery in this. Got a lovely saltiness, but it's got depth. It's not all just about the peat, and it's got some sort of lovely weight of spirit character and fruit and barley beneath. Yeah, it's quite gentle. It's a lovely nose, I think. Let's see what the palate's like. Heavier peat on the palate, more dusty, earthy kind of peat, as well as slightly medicinal peat. Again, the spirit is quite oily. It's rich. It's got some lovely apricot and barley notes that sort of sit underneath all that peat, so it's not quite so one-dimensional. It's got a lovely length, quite mouth-watering and almost citric. With a lovely saltiness right on the finish. It is a lovely 12-year-old Islay malt, it has to be said, and it lingers really nicely. It's a little bit of almost not quite heather, but sort of maybe sort of rushes, reedy kind of sort of notes on the finish. But again, really salty, lovely freshness, but balanced by some lovely sweet barley. So it is, you know, quite harmonious and really enjoyable, I think. Right, okay, so let's sum today's episode of the show. I think I banged them out pretty quickly, but having done no end of different competitions and what have you, one gets kind of used to sort of tasting pretty quickly and evaluating them on the fly, as they say. But anyway, let's get back to today's whiskies. The Glen Moray. I love the Glen Moray. I think, hand on heart, that's probably my favourite whisky of all of these. I mean, yes, all these whiskies have something interesting to offer, but you know, I just love that. I love it just ticked all my boxes. American oak character, sort of crisp, almost tropical fruit, big and juicy, and you know, just an all-round lovely whisky, and not expensive. So you know, bonus. Benrinnes, yeah, again, you know, nicely balanced, not too heavy on the sherry. You know, just to sort of like adding a little bit of wininess to it. I mean, Benrinnes is certainly one of those distilleries that crops up quite an awful lot in a number of the independents. So it's obviously a distillery that's quite happy to flog its casks. So and some of it is good, and like I said, some of it ain't very good at all. But that's a good one. So you know, that's good. The Cambus. Now I love the Cambus, and again, you know, not too heavy on the sherry, although I find that grain whiskies do tend to work really well with sherry. In actual fact, you get the nice combination of the dried kind of column still grainy character along with the dried fruit of the sherry cask, and it all kind of gets quite harmonious, and you think, yeah, it's got quite a lot of complexity, because you know, sometimes grain whiskey just aged in American oak can be a little bit simplistic, and that certainly isn't. You know, it's a lovely whisky. The Bruichladdich, yeah, I'm sure there are going to be a load of you that are going to go, yeah, that's a great whisky, and well, the quality's not bad. I've got no issue with that whatsoever, just in my opinion. Well, it's just basically when you've got limited shelf space and you have to make decisions, you know, sometimes it's not just a question of it's a poor quality whisky and I don't want to actually stock it. Sometimes there's absolutely nothing wrong with the quality of the whisky at all, but when you do the maths and you work out what you're going to sell it for, you just suddenly think, well, hang on, do I feel really comfortable with selling that whisky for that price? And if the answer is no, then, well, you know, they don't go on the shelf. And I'm afraid that's what's going to happen in that case. The island or the Orkney, yeah, I kind of ummed and ahed about this, it has to be said. I mean, again, not exactly a great deal of distillery character, lots and lots of sherry, lots and lots of winey PX, and although like I said, it's not the style I would particularly warm to. I certainly think there are obviously going to be customers that really like that kind of style, and it's interesting. It's a good quality whiskey, and like I said, it's kind of balanced between the sort of like the sort of silkiness of the sherry and the slight roughness of the actual spirit. So yeah, I think it's pretty well balanced. The Glenturret, again, you know, beats the pants off the distillery bottling, and it just goes to show that, like a lot of distilleries, the spirit they produce is pretty damn good, but by the time they're vatted together, God knows how many casks, there's going to be a few ropey ones thrown in there, and your end product is, well, a little bit bloody ropey. And maybe I'm being a little bit cynical, but you know, I know how distilleries work, and I know what they do, and you sort of sometimes wonder, Christ, did you really think that was a good bottling or a great thing to do? But anyway, that's not the case with this particular bottling, and this is what I love about single casks. There is no hiding. You can't get away from it. You can't vat it into anything else. You know, it lives or dies on its own kind of character, and you know, I really like that. I would certainly sort of suggest, you know, if you like peated malts and want something a little bit different, then I've got no issue with that one whatsoever. And the undisclosed Islay, well, yeah, it's a lovely 12-year-old peated Islay malt. It's pretty much peated Islay malt by numbers, it has to be said, but you know, sometimes at the end of the day there's absolutely nothing wrong with that at all. And it's, yeah, it does what it says on the tin, so to speak. So there you have it. I think all in all, I think sort of the third release from North Star is pretty damn good. I think sort of Ian's doing, you know, an absolutely magnificent job, and I know these are going to sort of sell particularly well because in such a short period of time, you know, Ian's, you know, got quite a following, and given how fast some of the other bottlings disappeared off the shelves, I'm sure these ones are probably going to follow suit. So if any of them sound like your kind of cup of tea, I would get hold of one sooner rather than later. So anyway, that's this week's episode of the show in the bag. I hope you've enjoyed it. I think I've got, and there's a minute left there on the battery life, so I better quickly say good afternoon and good Dram.